Salutations. My name is Kevin Garcia, and I am a professional comic book educator. Wait, that's not right. Professional comic book historian. I've actually been paid to read comic books by Marvel. I've contributed to the official handbook of the Marvel Universe and everything. And today we're going to be looking at the weird and winding world of Marvel's obscure history and some of the stuff that Disney probably doesn't know it bought when it purchased Marvel in 2009. I imagine everyone watching this has heard of the Avengers. Well, before they were box office hits in 1961, Fantastic Four #1 kicked off what people really think of as the Marvel Universe. And way before that, in 1939, Marvel Comics #1 kicked off the true history of the Marvel Universe. But I'm going to go back even farther than that to back when Marvel was making Pulp Fiction. See, way before they made comics, the company that made Marvel made Pulp. And Pulp magazines were essentially really, really cheap paper with really, really cheap stories that would tell, well, cheap stuff. And they could be anything from raunchy romance to sensational sci-fi to wild westerns. And they were combinations of a little bit of art and a lot of prose. Well, these things were being published by a man named Martin Goodman. Martin Goodman is the guy that eventually created Marvel, but he didn't call his company Marvel at first. He called it Manvis Publishing or Red Circle Magazines or Newsstand Press. He called it many different things, but you might recognize some of his titles because he liked putting Marvel in a lot of them. And he also had stories about characters like the X-Men, who was a secret agent that didn't have any powers, or the Avengers of Space, which was actually an alien invasion story. Well, not all of his stories are completely forgotten because a lot of them, didn't get reprinted. At least one of them is still around to this day, Ka-zar, and he's a totally original character. See, he was a nobleman who was abandoned in Africa and then raised by animals to become a hero in a loincloth. And I know there was that other guy who was, raised by apes, but this guy's totally different. Well, anyway, when Goodman decided to transition from pulps into comics, he brought Ka-zar with him. He had the original writer, Bob Bird, make the comics with the artists and everything. So while pulp was more prose and less art, comics were the other way around. And he liked bringing in stuff from many different characters, so many different places where he'd kind of steal ideas from other places. Copyright was kind of loose back then. There was a hero in the 30s called the Saint who would solve crimes by putting a little logo of a saint behind, kind of leaving his calling card. So Goodman had his people make the Angel. And in Marvel Comics #1, Angel showed up, and he was basically, what if Batman dressed like Superman? And he'd leave mark of an angel behind. Well, this guy went from comics to pulps. In 1941, Goodman had him create the Angel Detective, which was essentially the same character, same MO. Of course, he had his on the his angel mark on the butt of his gun. So he would actually bash the bad guys in the head and leave a mark of the angel Gabriel behind. This was a thing for heroes back in those days. They'd leave their calling card whenever they'd murder somebody. Anyway, this brings us to superheroes and Marvel's first comic, Marvel Comics #1. But what's really neat to me is that aside from the Angel and Ka-zar, some of the characters in this first book weren't even originally in Marvel. See, there's this guy called Namor the Submariner, and well, I imagine everybody now knows Aquaman, right? I hate Aquaman. Aquaman is a ripoff of Marvel's character, Namor the Submariner, who was the first undersea hero. He was also the first superhero to fly under his own power, back when Superman was still leaping tall buildings in a single bound. Well, Namor was truly Marvel's first superhero, although Ka-zar may have been his first regular hero, because Namor had all the powers, but he was also Marvel's first supervillain, in that he would attack New York City for polluting the ocean and then attack the Nazis for attacking New York City. Well, he first appeared not in Marvel Comics, but in Motion Picture Funnies Weekly, a small comic from another publisher. And he wasn't alone. There was another comic called The Amazing Mystery Funnies from Centaur Publications that featured a scientist, his nephew, and their bodyguard, Ken Masters, who's not a Street Fighter. And the three of them would go on adventures together. Well, these guys also showed up in Marvel Comics #1. See, copyright didn't really apply a lot in that Goodman would just ask writers and artists, bring me your stuff, and they'd bring it. So in the case of Namor and Ken Masters, they would bring it and then just expand on it in this new publication. Of course, superheroes didn't last forever. And by the end of the World War II, the superheroes were kind of on the outs. So Goodman had them publish other things, funny animals, horror, sci-fi, whatever. There were also a lot of comics that were aimed at girls and women, which is interesting because a few decades later, the common conventional wisdom was girls don't read comics. And we know for a fact that's not true. But to get an idea of how these things were made, it's a little bit different from what we think of. See, they had this character, Miss America. Now, Miss America was super strong. She had X-ray vision. She could fly, all that jazz. But she was in only about a fifth of her original books. See, most of the books was stuff like makeup tips or what to do if Johnny asks you out. And I realize that seems kind of antiquated and weird to nowadays, but at the time, readers loved it. They ate it up. They wrote in asking for more. And the most popular part of Miss America was actually a comic strip about teenagers. There was a teenager that had a rich brunette that liked him, and also a light-haired girl that was much nicer that also liked him. Yeah, Marvel was ripping off Archie. But in this case, Archie wasn't the main character. Betty was. And Betty's name was Patsy Walker. She took over the book in the sense that by issue 3 or 4, Miss America stopped showing up, and now it was Patsy Walker's book. And it remained that way for the next 20 years. In fact, if you've ever watched Jessica Jones, you've seen Patsy Walker because she's Trish. That's right. Trish is older than most Marvel superheroes, having been around since 1946. Now, while Marvel was making these comics, well, called Timely at those days, it was making comics, Goodman was making other magazines, including Stag magazines. I find these things very interesting. Stag magazines were basically aimed at men, and they had sexist jokes, and they would have lurid tales of men rescuing women that needed it and that kind of stuff. But what's really neat is a lot of these Stag magazines had these comics in the middle, and they told this story of a character called Pussycat, who was the agent for an acronymed agency called SCORE, and they would fight the enemies of lust. Well, SCORE, the secret council of ruthless extroverts, would send her out, and she was a bubble-headed blonde that didn't know how attractive she was. She would actually solve just about every crime by losing her top, and again, they didn't show anything. But what I think is really neat about Pussycat here is that she actually got referenced in a Marvel comic recently. About 10 years ago, there was a Defenders comic where there was a bunch of reality warping. And at the bottom of one of the pages, it says, "Follow the adventures of Pussycat as she fights lust." So she's canon. Good enough for me. Now, by the 50s, Marvel wanted to get back into the superhero game, and they tried, but they weren't as successful as DC. DC Comics was much more successful with their reinvention of Flash and Green Lantern and those other characters. Marvel was stuck doing monster books, which, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and those guys enjoyed doing. But they really, really wanted to do superheroes, so they snuck superheroes into their monster books. See, what if you had a teenager who got bit by a creature, and that creature transformed him, and he wore a costume? And that was the birth of the real Marvel universe as we think of it today, but that's not what this talk's about. So let's leave the stuff you know about alone, and let's go to the really, really weird stuff. See, Marvel was inspired by other comics and wanted to do what they were doing. And around this time in the 60s and 70s, underground comics were becoming really big, especially thanks to a guy named R. Crumb. He would do a lot of LSD and draw whatever popped into his head, and it was really, well, it looked like whatever a high guy would do, a guy who was high would do. And his books had racism and sexism and a lot of stuff, but it was very unfiltered, and people read it. Wasn't super financially successful, but definitely got a lot of critical acclaim. So Stan wanted to do this, and he created the Comics book. You can tell it's serious because they put an X on it. And now, Comics book had a little bit of Marvel material, but most of the stuff belonged to the creators themselves. And when Comics book was not financially successful, and they had to cancel it after 3 issues, Marvel was nice enough to give it to Kitchen Sink Press to finish the last issue. And a lot of these characters and stories continued off in other things. For example, Panthea here is the story of a half woman, half lion, and that's literal because her mother did some freaky stuff. But there were other comics as well, including Barefoots, which got a lot of critical acclaim, and Mouse, which is the first comic to get a Pulitzer Prize, and that first appeared in a Marvel comic. Marvel was still doing pulp magazines at this time, although they mixed and matched them with their comics. So they would have a lot of magazines out there and realized that while comic books were hampered by a thing called the Comics Code Authority, which prevented them from showing things like murder and bad guys always had to go to jail and that kind of thing, they realized that if they called it a magazine and not a comic, they could put whatever they wanted in there. Now, you'd think that would mean they do a lot of R-rated stuff, but they kept it PG-13. These ended by the end of the 70s, and in the 80s, they tried to do a few more. For example, Savage Tales included some neat stuff. One of the things in Savage Tales was a comic called The Nam, and it was actually so interesting, Marvel spun it off into its own series. It became critically acclaimed as being the story of just real normal people in the Vietnam War. No superheroes at all, except for the 4 or 5 issues where Punisher showed up. The biggest thing Marvel did during this time was Epic. Now, Epic was a magazine where Marvel really tried to push the envelope, going beyond heavy metal, really pushing the envelope on high concept sci-fi. What's really interesting, though, to me, is that they'd have Marvel-owned properties like the Last Galactus story right next to Cerebus by Dave Sims. Now, Dave Sims was an icon, a legend in the indie comics world, in that he created what was the longest-running comic that was still drawn by its original creator when it ended. And he got a lot of respect until people realized he was nuts. But it's just cool that you have this iconoclastic guy next to an icon like Galactus. Now, Epic transitioned away from being a magazine into being an imprint, where Marvel would tell indie creators, okay, you can publish your own magazines. We'll put our name on it, and you get to keep the rights. Pretty cool, pretty good deal. But Marvel being Marvel still did some of their own stuff inside of this. So, for example, in Epic, you'd find Powerline, which is part of the Shadowline saga, which belonged to Marvel. So it actually showed up later in the Secret Wars storyline. And I know that it belonged to Marvel because of the thing I look for every time I buy an indie book. I'm looking at the indicia. I'm wanting to find who owns what. If the creator owns it, they get to keep the rights and go and continue with it elsewhere. But if the company owns it and you sell your company, that means whoever now owns the company owns the rights. And that applies to a lot of what I'm looking at today. For example, there was a company called Amazing that became a company called Pied Piper, and they merged with a company called Wonder. And these guys had a super original comic called The Ex-Mutants. Now, I know what you're thinking, but see, these guys were separated from the rest of humanity by a genetic difference. They protected a world that feared and hated them. But the difference is the world that feared and hated them were a world full of mutants. These guys were humans. It was one guy and 4 hot girls, because that's how that works in these comics. And it wasn't super amazing, but one thing I think is kind of neat is that around this time, the X-Men got a spinoff called The New Mutants. So the Ex-Mutants got a spinoff called The New Humans. Again, very original. There was another company around this time called Aircel. Now, Aircel had a bunch of really neat comics. These comics would cover neat experimental stuff, I think a little bit above average for a lot of the indie comics of the 80s. One of the comics that got my attention is this one here. You'll see in the corner there that has this guy who's the totality of a universe. I don't know the whole story because I only have some of these books, but I do know that this guy would be really amazing in a Doctor Strange storyline. Well, Aircel did a lot of experimental comics. They did color ones, they did black and white ones, some of them that were groundbreaking and some of them that were kind of cringy. They had these elf comics that, ranged in quality. They were pretty good. But the elves did have some spinoffs, including this one, which is the only comic that I don't feel comfortable showing a single panel from. I will say I did buy it in Lawrence, though, so go Lawrence. The point is, Aircel had a lot of cool stuff, including the earliest comics by creator Dale Keown. Now, Dale Keown later got known as one of the best Hulk artists ever, and some of his early books are some of his best art ever. And I really wish Marvel would reprint them because, hey, again, technically, Marvel owns these. Marvel bought a company that bought a company that bought a company. So Marvel owns this just like they own this. Yeah, Marvel owns Men in Black. And if you watch the movies, it says usually at the beginning, based on the Marvel comic. And this is kind of true. See, the Men in Black movie had been in the works for years. And by the time it actually got made, Marvel had bought the company who bought the company who bought the company. So actually, it was based on a comic that Marvel just happened to own. It was just one of those things that was good luck on their part. Well, Aircel and Pied Piper sold themselves to Eternity, which sounds very dramatic. But Eternity did mostly movie tie-in comics. These were licensed books where whenever possible, they'd get permission from the movie studio, unless the movie studio didn't own permission, in which case, like Plan 9 here, they just do whatever they wanted with it. And Eternity did some average books. I wouldn't say they were super exciting. But there's another company around this time that I want to talk about called Adventure. They made some above average books, but they didn't last very long either because they, along with Eternity, were purchased by a company called Malibu Comics. Now, Malibu primarily published other people's books, but they did have some of their own. One of their own comics was The Protectors, and this was a comic that was filled entirely with characters that were in the public domain from the Centaur Publications line. Centaur is the same company that I mentioned earlier from Ken Masters, who showed up in Marvel Comics #1. Well, they wanted to make themselves a bit distinguished, so they would make really unique covers, and they would try to make these covers as unique as possible, including cutting holes into them. See, this was supposed to be the gimmick. A hero dies in this issue, so they have a bullet hole going all the way through. They didn't put very much thought into it, though, because it cuts into the story and the art and the ads. And in fact, the hero doesn't even get shot. He gets punched to death by a villain named Mr. Monday. Garfield would hate him. They tried the same thing again later with cutting an issue into the shape of a hero's head. Well, Malibu's greatest thing was to try to expand beyond this and merge all these different things. They included something they bought from Eternity called the Dinosaurs for Hire. These were a fourth wall breaking team of dinos that were mercenaries that could be hired, hence the name. Pretty well done, although a lot of sexism at the time again, but still well done. Well, the Dinosaurs for Hire and the Protectors and the Ex-Mutants all got merged into the Genesis storyline along with other characters like the Dead Clown, who was a deformed guy that healed really fast and told morbid jokes while killing superheroes. This wasn't super successful, but they next tried something even bigger, and that was getting these guys into video games like Dinosaurs for Hire and the Ex-Mutants. I do want to point out about Dinosaurs for Hire that while they did belong to Malibu at the time, the original creator, Tom Mason, recently applied and got a trademark for his characters, so I guess he got them back. I guess Marvel just didn't care enough to check. There goes my plans for a Deadpool Dinosaurs for Hire crossover. Malibu later put out the Ultraverse, which anybody who read comics in the early 90s should be familiar with. These guys were really, really critically acclaimed. They made some of the great superhero comics of those 2 years that they published. Marvel purchased them shortly around that time. So characters like the Lord Pumpkin here, who's essentially Loki if he had a rotting pumpkin for a head, and I just think that's amazing, got folded into the Marvel Universe, sort of. See, they had this really, really great crossover called the Ultra Force Avengers, written by Warren Ellis and drawn by George Perez, and it did what Marvel promised, bringing a lot of Marvel characters to the Ultraverse, propping up the Ultraverse, but it may never get republished, and I don't know why. See, they shortly afterwards, Ultraverse stopped selling and they stopped publishing them and they stopped making them. And for whatever reason, Marvel's never gone back to them. They haven't republished these characters. They haven't brought them into any other comics. In fact, there was a story recently where Galactus needed the Infinity Stones, and this Ultraverse character called Rune actually had one of the stones. So Galactus stuck his arm through a portal in the reality, pulled out the skeleton of this vampire, and took the stone from it. And apparently the original art actually had him looking very much like Rune, but when it published, it was just a generic skeleton. It's like they couldn't even admit he was in the Ultraverse. And honestly, I don't know why. Now, there's another company around this time that is not related to any of the other ones that I've been mentioning. And this was CrossGen. Apparently, it was a really rich guy who wanted to make his own comic universe, so he just paid a bunch of guys to make it. CrossGen united all their comics by this sigil that gave powers to everyone. It could be a Western or a sword and sorcery or a superhero book, and they'd all be connected in some way. Unlike the Ultraverse, Marvel did bring these guys back recently, publishing new stories about CrossGen characters, taking a little bit of that 90s excess out and making them a little bit more modern. Now, leaving alone stuff that was outside of Marvel, there were things that have always been inside of Marvel but tend to be forgotten. For example, there were international books. Now, originally that meant making very cheap comics with very cheap paper. But Marvel really wanted to push the envelope. And in the 70s, they opened up Marvel UK to make some original comics. That also meant in the 80s that they brought in Alan Moore, considered to be one of the greatest comic book writers of all time. But Marvel and DC both pissed him off, so he stopped working for Marvel after a while. Still, while he was there, he created the Fury, who is one of the most unbeatable characters to ever show up in a comic book and not be used as part of a major company crossover. Captain Britain, for the stories, should be showing up in Disney Plus soon, so hopefully we'll get to see some Fury. I'd love to see it. Now, British publications used a weekly schedule, while American ones used a monthly schedule. So what the British people had to do was fill in those gaps. And that meant sometimes making new stories, and sometimes they were in a rush. It was actually a case where they took the American superhero Killraven, who is a superhero that fights Martians, and just literally redrew those comics to create the Ape Slayer to fill in gaps in Planet of the Apes comics. So now you have the Ape Slayer who fights gorillas from space. And honestly, isn't that the hero we need today? Marvel Italia was not as successful as Marvel UK. It took about 20 years before Euroforce so much as guest starred in an American comic. I will say that Marvel's Japanese comics have had a little bit more success lately, although they've been published by many different publishers. There's been a resurgence of Japanese comics lately, and that meant Marvel got to do a crossover between Attack on Titan and the Avengers, which is pretty cool. It also means, rumor has it, that Spider-Man from Japan will get to cross over with Spider-Verse in the next movie. I really love to see that. In fact, that seems about as good a place as any to kind of wrap this up, because Well, I worked for Marvel for about 10 years. My first assignment for them was writing about Ken Masters that I mentioned from Marvel Comics #1. And my last assignment was writing about the Japanese Spider-Man. And with that, I'd like to kind of tie this all together by showing how I kind of link all these guys together. See, you had Wonder Comics, which became part of Pied Piper Comics, which became part of Eternity Comics. You get the idea. All of it merged together to become part of the House of Ideas that is Marvel. And because Disney bought Marvel, now they're all part of the House of Ideas that is the House of Mouse. All right. Well, with that, my name is Kevin Garcia, and that's my presentation.
Go to nerdnite.com to find a Nerd Nite event near you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for our latest presentation.